This kind of cynicism is virtue can be taught. Virtue is sufficient for happiness. Virtue is perhaps better taught through pain and bad reputation than pleasure and good reputation. And that virtue is actions. It's not learning or words.
Welcome to Stoa Conversations. My name is Caleb Ontiveros.
And I'm Michael Tremblay.
And today we're going to be talking about the philosopher Antisthenes. So Antisthenes was an ancient Greek philosopher, of course. And we're talking about him because he was a Cynic and actually has some connections of lineage to the Stoics. So you can think of the founder of Stoicism, Zeno. He was taught by Crates, or I suppose some people say Crates. Do you have a preference there, Michael? Crates, Crates?
Let's do Crates.
All right, so he was taught by Crates, who was taught by Diogenes, and then Antisthenes was a teacher of Diogenes, and we're talking about Diogenes, the Cynic, of course, Diogenes of Sinope. So there's that direct connection to Stoic lineage, if you will, and he's just an important figure in Cynic philosophy, which is emerging during really this efflorescent time of Greek philosophy. You have Socrates, and then Socrates' followers spawn a whole range of different philosophies of life, ways of living, have much in common with the original teachings of Stoicism, but each school, from I would think of the Cynics, Skeptics, Stoics, and such, really take on a different slice of what Socrates emphasized, and ended up building out different systems from his teachings. So that's what we're going to be doing today.
Yeah, we've talked a lot about the Cynic school for the reasons you just raised. That lineage to Stoicism. I mean, Epictetus really admires the Cynics. Some Stoics are more cynical than others. And Antisthenes is the founder of Cynicism. He's the first Cynic. So he was the teacher of Diogenes, the Cynic, the very famous one. The one we did an episode on Diogenes, guy who lived in the barrel, a guy who would argue with Plato. And Antisthenes was his teacher. And Antisthenes was a follower or a contemporary of Socrates, and really was the first Cynic. So here's where it all started for the Cynic school.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you our episode on Diogenes, that's 144. I also had some interesting conversations with Mark Usher, I believe, who has some nice translations of Cynic works, Cynic excerpts, and that was episode 118, and we'll leave links to those in the description. But so we're going to talking about Antisthenes today, and we'll start maybe by giving a sense of who he was, some biographical details we have from him, and then get into some of his teachings or aphorisms or lines, and then perhaps wrap up by connecting it to Stoicism explicitly. So Antisthenes, he was a warrior. Diogenes Laertius notes that he distinguished himself in the Battle of Tanagra. He was a pupil of Gorgias, the rhetorician or the sophist, or Gorgias. There's a famous Platonic dialogue titled Gorgias, and that's a dialogue between Socrates and this rhetorician, this sophist. So that's who Antisthenes studied under, but he also came in touch with Socrates, and Diogenes Laertius writes that he derived so much benefit from him that he used to advise his own disciples to become fellow pupils with him of Socrates. So he's a great admirer of Socrates, of course. But you can also see he took a lot from Gorgias' teachings about rhetoric and such.
So we're going to be pulling from Diogenes Laertius's Lives of Eminent Philosophers. He also gets a treatment from Xenophon. So we might reference a bit of that too. Xenophon was one of the other sources we have for Socrates. He's also a historian. In school, I read some of Xenophon's histories, and he wrote about Antisthenes as well. So that's kind of what we're pulling on from our sources here. I think yours was straight from Diogenes, but I'll pull from Xenophon as well a bit for some of his philosophy too. But no, I think you're getting that same thing of like, we put Socrates on a pedestal, and sometimes there's this bit of like, history is written by the victors. And sometimes I think there's this risk of, was Socrates that smart? Was Socrates that great? Or is it just, Plato really liked him and Plato got popular and so on and so forth? And so I always think it's cool to see other philosophers, entirely different traditions, entirely different schools of thought, like Antisthenes here, who was like, oh, this Socrates guy, he really knows what he's talking about too. He's really onto something. And that's kind of a cool, it kind of cements the respect we give Socrates as well.
Yeah, that's a great point. The fact that there are so many other historical figures who thought he was an impressive fellow and were inclined to do the best they could to effectively follow in his footsteps speaks well of him. As Michael said, I take most of my sources, most of my learnings from Antisthenes from Diogenes Laertius. So I'll go through that, and then you can toss in any color we get from Xenophon. One great line that Diogenes has for Antisthenes, which explains his impact on the philosophers, the men around him, is the following: that he gave impulse to the indifference of Diogenes, the continence of Crates, and the hardihood of Zeno, himself laying the foundations of their state. So perhaps he's not a philosopher we talk about or think about so often these days, but he, I think, does, as Diogenes say, give a formative influence on all three of them, which is another reason to go over him. So I get the next. That's just a little bit of biographical details. One of the main questions, of course, with him, with any philosopher, is what were his teachings, what were some of his aphorisms, lines, and such. And with like many other Cynic philosophers, there's not a clear systematic presentation that we have of his philosophy, but we do have a few, some short summaries, in addition to many common sayings of his or anecdotes about him. So some of the key ones that I pulled out is, of course, this emphasis on virtue for the Cynics. We commonly explain the Cynic philosophy and oppose it to Stoicism by saying, look, the Cynics basically state that virtue is necessary and sufficient for the good life, and that's all you need, virtue. Whereas the Stoics, they're trying to carve a middle path between the Cynics and the Aristotelians, or the Aristotelians state that virtue, that's necessary for a good life, but you also need some external things for you to have a good life. So you need some external things to go well. You need to be healthy, wealthy enough, have a good reputation and such. And that's necessary for a good life. What the Stoics want to say, taking that middle road between the two, is that virtue is necessary and sufficient for a good life, but there are also these things we prefer to have, like health, good reputation amongst good people, and so on. So that the Cynic view is that then more extreme, and that's one reason why people like Epictetus admire it, is because it has that extreme focus on virtue, as that's all you need. And many of the Cynics disdained things like what the Stoics would call preferred indifference, things like wealth, good reputation. And I think that was an important part of their philosophy, really, was to almost take a kind of minimalistic approach to life, where it's exemplified by Diogenes, of course, living in a barrel, owning a single cup, and then throwing that away when he realizes, oh, I can just drink with my hands and such. There's that famous anecdote of Diogenes. But I think that's, if in a way, that's one of the, I think, the central teachings of the Cynics, is that virtue is all you need, and virtue isn't found by interacting with what the Stoics would call preferred indifference as much. It's really a rejection of that and a kind of minimalism.
Yeah, there's this interesting thing here. I mean, so that's a good summary of the Cynic school. And we're getting that from Antisthenes. There's this interesting point here about how, there's this focus on virtue. Uh, Virtue can be taught, but also this, can be gained. It's not something you're born with, but also this kind of this minimalism, this anti, joining a formal school, sleeping in a nice bed, going to classes, learning. So I almost wonder with this. I mean, I'm not sure how much Diogenes Laertius talks about this in his sources, but I'm curious about, what is the view here? What is Antisthenes' view on how this is taught? It almost seems to me like the Cynic position is like you get corrupted, and so it's almost like not like you learn virtue, but you almost like avoid temptation. Because how are you supposed to learn it if you're off drinking water from a stream with your hands? I guess what are you really learning there? I guess you're learning to go without. I guess you're learning that you're still happy. Most times when people want to learn things, they go and they say, "Well, it's good to have money because if I have money, I can go to a better school and I can get a better teacher and I can focus on learning instead of focusing on working a job." And there's these kind of reasonings, but there's both this view that virtue is what you need to be happy, virtue is good, virtue can be taught, but we don't want these possessions, which seem to be the kinds of things that allow people to get taught and allow people to learn. Um, that was a bit all over the place, but that's kind of what I'm thinking with this. That's the weird part of the Cynic perspective is it's almost like yeah, like again, like you're corrupted by other people, not like you can benefit from them. So you have to almost sit outside their society. What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. It's well put, and I think it's striking that one of Antisthenes' phrases that connects to this is he was asked what learning is the most necessary. He replied, "How to get rid of having anything to unlearn,"
Oh wow, there you go.
which which is essentially saying, you've been taught all this nonsense. What we're trying to do next here is, get rid of that nonsense, unlearn what you need to, and almost go back to a sort of implied, maybe a natural state where you're able to live according to nature, live that virtuous life without the uh, illusions of social pressure, what have you.
Mm-hmm.
So, and then of course your next question is, well, just how did the Cynics do that, and can you do that even when you've rejected so much of the city, of other people, material possessions, and such? And perhaps it is worth stating that my sense is that Antisthenes was not as radical as Diogenes in his behavior. I don't think he lived in a barrel. It
he
doesn't
didn't
seem
have
like.
he didn't have a matching barrel.
Yeah, he didn't have he wasn't barrel neighbors or what have you. And by all accounts, did seem to interact with other Athenians in a more traditional way, I
Mm.
suppose.
So maybe it's like and I'm not a Cynic expert, but maybe there's this idea of Antisthenes lays down these ideas, and Diogenes is like, well, the logical conclusion of your ideas is I should not learn anything. I need to unlearn. I need to kind of sit outside of society. Maybe Diogenes is either taking them to their logical conclusion or at least being consistent with one interpretation of these ideas. About the importance of unlearning or the importance of not having anything to unlearn by not being corrupted or getting these fake social pressures that dictate our lives.
I think so. I think so. So you have the beginnings of some of Diogenes' philosophy, some of the beginnings of Diogenes' radicalism, but Antisthenes doesn't go all the way. And just to give you a sense of that, some more of his beliefs. From This is from Diogenes of Laertius, of course. And he held virtue to be sufficient in and of itself to ensure happiness, since it needed nothing else except the strength of a Socrates, which is to say, to be a philosopher. And he maintained that virtue is an affair of deeds and does not need a store of words or learning, that the wise man is self sufficing, for all the goods of others are his, and that ill repute is a good thing, and much the same as pain. and that the wise man will be guided in his public acts not by established laws, but by the laws of virtue. And he continues, but I think you can see both, of course, some amount of stoicism, but also that idea that you really shouldn't care what your reputation is, and that pain is plausibly a good thing. He has an earlier instance where he says he talks about the story of Hercules, his I think overcoming pain and considering that kind of difficult experiences are necessary to demonstrate or to form the right kind of character, someone who is able to withstand whatever adversity and do great things, I suppose, or do great deeds. Perhaps why he considered pain at least instrumentally good. And one way, and I suppose get some way, that was a little bit all over the place, but I suppose that's one way in which you start to become more virtuous is through these experiences of pain, had in the right way, presumably.
Yeah, if you break that down, there's a lot of like, I almost feel like we need a spectrum. We need like the more cynical versus less cynical. On one side, you've got your Seneca, not very cynical. On the other side, you got your Musonius Rufus, maybe your Epictetus, pretty cynical. Because some of this stuff, very not like if you're thinking of a Seneca, this idea like pain is good, bad reputation is good, very not Seneca, but very maybe even not Marcus Aurelius. Maybe Marcus Aurelius is like the true neutral. We need the we need the Dungeons and Dragons affinity guide here. But when you start saying things like pain is a good, you hear that in Musonius Rufus. That's something he talks about. Um, and the idea there, as you said, it's well, the question I raised was, well, how do you learn this? Well, maybe you learn it through experiencing pain. Maybe you learn it through experiencing bad reputation. And Epictetus talks to this. This is kind of a memento mori, uh, premeditatio malorum, and then the other one of like undergoing hardship on purpose. These are ways that the Stoics teach us to learn things, like thinking about bad things, experiencing bad things. You learn truths about the world, and so maybe that's a way you can learn by experiencing pain, by being outcast or unpopular. You can learn things. I mean, I think about that about like I have this view in my own life where I'm almost more sympathetic to people that were less popular when they were younger because I almost feel like having that hardship of being a bit of an outsider can develop some character, can make you think, oh, well, actually being popular isn't all it's cracked up to be, or like I'm a bit less shallow because I experienced being on the bottom of the totem pole in some capacity, whether that was in high school or in with a group of friends or something like this. And so there's maybe the same idea here, right? If you have bad reputation, is a good thing because you learn something. You learn how foolish the pursuit of reputation is. You learn how undeserving some of the people that have good reputation are. If you experience pain, same kind of thing. I can endure it. It's not as bad as I imagined it to be. I'm actually still able to overcome and endure. So there's some lessons from these hardships, and maybe that can be your teacher.
I think something crucial that we don't that I'd be curious to know more about here is that it seems like pain itself isn't sufficient to either learn philosophy or unlearn what you need to. Because some people experience pain and it seems like they come out the worse for it. They're either defeated or they take away the wrong lessons, or whereas others are able to have that experience adversity and then they learn the right things. They learn that maybe good reputation isn't so valuable, whereas other people might think, instead of coming away with suffering from the lack of popularity when they're younger, crave it even more so. And you can see that almost drive a life
Yeah, it's a good point.
in a way. So I wonder then what strategies Antisthenes and some of the other Stoics then would have for experiencing pain well.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's an easy answer other than the reason you approach it. You if you approach it in the right way, you'll gain some sort of benefit from it. But I think you raise a good point, which is like for every person who experiences a setback and learns about their capacity for perseverance, there's somebody else who experiences something and becomes bitter and jaded and angry. And so the pain. Well, it's the Stoic view, right? The pain isn't indifferent. You can take good things from it, or you can take bad things from it. So to go out and say pain is a good, it's not the Stoic position for the exact reason you're raising, Caleb. It's like depends on how you use it. And I guess the Stoic view on how to use it well is really to approach it with a philosophical view. Otherwise, it's just up to luck. Some people respond to it properly, some people don't.
Yeah, that's right. I suppose. And one Stoic advice here is that from Seneca, and perhaps because he is less of a cynic, is to use pain and hardship in a controlled way. That's the practice when he advises voluntary discomforts. You eat poorly for a day, or sleep on the floor for an evening. It's clear what your purpose for doing that kind of thing is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the idea of not too much, right? Not too much
Mm-hmm.
to to break you, just enough to like exercise, right? We've talked about this before. Just enough to make the muscle stronger, not to tear it off the bone. That has to be the approach. Everybody has a limit uh, when it comes to pain or stress or hardship, and you can't mindset shift your way past your current level of progress, right? You can't just will it to be a good lesson. At least you can find a silver lining sometimes, but um, there's not, people can't just take unlimited amounts of those things unless they're prepared for it. Some other things I wanted to take up in the passages you just read, and this was from Diogenes on his philosophy. I like this idea of virtue is an affair of deeds and does not need a
Mm-hmm.
store of words or learning. That's a kind of an anti-intellectualist, or I would say not an intellectualist, but I don't know, academic, like anti kind of, you do it's the same idea from Epictetus, right? You do philosophy to be a good person, not to know a lot about books, not to recite things. Virtue is how you act. It's not, how much philosophy you've read. That's cool to see. The idea that the wise man is self-sufficient, that's a Stoic idea. The idea, and then when you think to pre-Stoicism, because post-Stoicism, a lot of these ideas are introduced and they're a lot less controversial. But pre-Stoicism, these first two ideas from a little bit earlier in the passage, he says that virtue can be taught and that nobility belongs to nobody else than the virtuous. Even this idea that virtue could be taught, think of this in if we think of um, like royalty, you're thinking of medieval Britain. There's this tendency for humans to be like, oh well, there's those great people, there's those wonderful, amazing people, the Herculeses in ancient Greek example, the Achilles. Some people are just born excellent. They're just built different, as they
Mm-hmm.
wouldn't say, but we might say today. Um, and the point here again that Stoic egalitarian point. To say virtue can be taught is just to say no. Everybody can become excellent. Everybody can learn. Maybe not everybody, but many people can learn to be excellent. I don't know if he thinks everybody can. And that's a shift in the perspective from just the view that some people are just born. Like Alexander the Great is just born to be king, and he's just different from a regular person. And that's a kind of a different view here. And then that other idea that only the virtuous are noble. Um, that's just again saying excellence is virtue. Being a great person is being virtuous, and pre Stoicism, that's a pretty radical Stoic claim, pre Stoicism, right? That's like really shifting the view away from status or reputation or family or any of these other things that people will point to, and they point to great people or great families, which is kind of cool. We see that strain straight through into Stoicism.
Yeah, I think so. I think he's Socratic in that way. I think that's a natural reading of Socrates, the original Socrates, perhaps. I think that might be somewhat controversial. Maybe Plato in the Republic suggests that Socrates isn't entirely egalitarian. There are different kinds of people and such. There's a myth of the metals, but I think you do see in some dialogues, at least, Socrates believes that virtue can be taught, and perhaps that can
Mm-hmm.
be taught to. It isn't just given by blood or by family, what have you. But yeah, Antisthenes made it much clearer. And he also related to this. He also had the saying that virtue is the same for women as for men, which is consistent with the ideas that it can be taught. And it's also, of course, that theme we'll see in the Stoics, Musonius Rufus in particular. I think there's certainly some ambiguity, like what does being is the same mean, but at least the Stoics, of course, believe that both men and women are capable of virtue. Antisthenes does as well. So that's going to be another similar thread. I think that's probably something we could talk about that some more, but that is something that Stoics, what that looks like in practice, is different across different Stoics. Apparently, Zeno himself was um, believed that men and women could be sages as part of his Republic, a work we do not have. It's a work that some Stoics were embarrassed by. They thought it
Oh,
wasn't any
really?
good, uh, and and then of course, Musonius Rufus is something like a. Some people have called him a proto-feminist. Some people disagree with that. Disagree with that assessment. So that's something we could look into. We could look into more at some point. But regardless, I think that's this focus on virtue, this idea that it can be taught, is sort of pushing away from some of those other, maybe a natural reading many earlier humans have. People have today in some ways that are more implicit, is that is virtue is fixed, or some people are just born differently and such.
See, I mean, as you raise, you're really seeing the family tree of Socrates. A lot of these are things that maybe are introduced for the first time in our writings in Socrates, or as we have them in Plato's representations of Socrates. But there's almost this evidence here. Well, if Antisthenes was influenced by Socrates and he was arguing for these things, there's almost more evidence that this is Socrates' position. We don't just have to rely on Plato's position. We see that influence straight through Antisthenes all the way down to Zeno and Stoicism, which is cool. It's a real solid lineage from Socrates to the Stoics,
Mm-hmm.
through these middle pieces like this.
Yep, absolutely. There are a few lines that I wanted to share. So there's one story about him when he's being initiated into the Orphic mysteries. The priest said that those admitted into these rites would be partakers of many good things in Hades. Why then, said he, don't you die? And that's Antisthenes. It sort of reminds me of a trolley atheist, hearing about heaven and such. You're like, oh, if heaven's so great, why is it so bad to die? I understand that's not a knockdown argument by any means for our more religious listeners, but there is that question. It's a funny image, I think, to imagine Antisthenes talking back to the Orphic priest. There's also he has a number of good lines about flattery, but one thing that he used to say is that it's better to fall in with crows than flatterers, for in one case you are devoured when dead, in the other case while alive.
Hmm. It's I mean, I guess was there some sort of bad connotation about crows that I'm missing here? Some sort of historical better to be hanging out with birds than people that like what? I'm just trying to think of the pushback. Like, yeah, flatterers are bad, but why the? He's like, believe it or not, I would prefer birds. Um, and all the Greeks are like, oh, birds, they suck. Anyway, I don't know if there's some context I'm missing about the crows. I mean, I think in ancient Greek they used to say like off to the crows when you died. So maybe there is that point there of like something about maybe some sort of connotation with death.
Yeah,
Um,
well, crows are opportunistic scavengers. They're opportunistic scavengers. So
that's it.
that's and we don't actually see this as much. We think of, at least in the States, we've got turkey vultures, but crows, I suppose, have sufficient. At least I don't see it very much. They have sufficient food, I suppose, not to deal with the dead. So
Crows have really gotten better. They've really
yeah,
gotten better. Okay, so
this is
crows.
a sign
So
of world progress, really.
so sorry to pull this out, but so then crows were opportunistically like devouring dead bodies or something like this, and people were like, "Oh, crows are gross." And he's like, "I'd rather hang out with those guys eating bodies than people that like, you know, kiss up to you, because that's you when you're dead versus the flatterers. They ruin you when you're alive." Yeah, good point.
Yeah, yeah. So that's some lines from Antisthenes. Another one, which an important theme we haven't talked about as much, is being asked what was the height of human bliss. He replied, to die happy. And there's some amount of contradiction there, of course. Perhaps that does point at another common theme in Greek culture, but also Greek philosophy specifically, which is this focus on dying well and that being a part of what it is to live well. And in fact, Diogenes Laertius sort of critiques Antisthenes at the very end of the piece by suggesting that some people thought Antisthenes didn't die that well, where he could have died a better death. Yeah, Timon, he said he died of a disease, and he didn't say take the honorable way out, perhaps, but stuck on too long to life, I suppose is what some said. Though Timon was generally thought to be unfriendly to people, so perhaps that's not something we should make too much noise about. But I think at the very least it highlights that importance that many saw to dying well, and that's just as important, or perhaps that's an essential part of what it is to live well for the ancient Greeks, really.
Yeah.
So I think that's another key theme that we have at least in Antisthenes and throughout many of the Stoics. Of course, believe this. Earlier Greeks believe this.
Yeah, I'm reading the passage now. It's kind of sad. It goes, such was your nature, Antisthenes, that in your lifetime you were a very bulldog, to rend the heart with words, if not with teeth. Yet you died of consumption. It's like that old like Oregon Trail video game or whatever. It's like, oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
You were
that's
such a you thought you were such a cool guy. You died of consumption. Yeah, I
and
don't know
the
what to
next
think
bit
of
is maybe some will say, "What of that?"
that. So I don't know why I find that so funny. It's like they're insulting each other, but I don't. They're trying to be as sassy as possible, but I don't find it that. I don't think there's anything insulting about dying of consumption. But I guess the point here is that he stuck onto life too long. He didn't commit suicide when he was still vibrant. He like suffered because he was afraid of death or something. In a way that people were, maybe if not objectively judging him for, at least maybe calling him a hypocrite or something. Along these lines, I'm just trying to think of the most charitable way to read this insult.
Yeah, I think so. It was earlier. They they think he showed some amount of weakness
Mm-hmm.
in his trial, perhaps a fear of death. You have any philosophers arguing against that, and perhaps it suggests that maybe he didn't live up to his philosophy of dying happy. If that's really the point of philosophy, then. And I think that there is sort of an interesting question about
Oh, I
how
understand.
how serious are you supposed to take someone's teaching if well, I think there are these two angles. There's sort of the hypocrite angle where you wonder, how serious are you supposed to take someone's teaching if they don't display it when it really matters according to them. And then there's also, I think, the point about general culture where the Greeks would have just thought, failing to die well would have said something badly about you, regardless of whether you're being a hypocrite or not.
Yeah, you're supposed to die well, but um, died sick, afraid of death, or unwilling to commit suicide earlier. So
Yeah, I guess implicit is it's not just that he got sick or something like that. It's like he must have been sick and at least in some ways showed
maybe,
weakness. The Greeks were not maybe
yeah.
they didn't show the mental strength they were hoping for, or something like this.
Well, that's too bad. That's kind of
Yeah,
sad.
it's too bad. He could have been a sage, but he did not make the cut.
Some will say, "What of that?" Oh man, Whew. Rough.
Yeah, it's hard to make the cut for a sagehood, we're afraid.
Yeah, a lot of judgmental guys back then. Like,
Yeah.
do everything right for 60 years and die of consumption, not worth anything anymore.
Well, we should
Um,
share some more lines from him because we don't want to end this on an L.
yeah, yeah.
So I think something else that I liked from a few of these A few of these profiles from Diogenes is that you get to see the philosophers taunting one another. So he has some words for Plato. He used to taunt Plato with being conceited. At all events, when in a procession, he spied a spirited charger. He said, turning to Plato, "It seems to me that you would have made just such a proud, showy steed." Yeah,
That's
so
funny.
he makes fun of Plato for being conceited, which is, I think, also shows a kind of irreverence. Maybe there's a learning there where with some of these ancient works, that reminder to keep in mind that many of these philosophers made fun of one another, Plato, Antisthenes, and such, and that should maybe inform a kind of. I think that should inform how we read them, of course, not put them on too high of a pedestal.
Yeah, they were just people. And yeah, we don't feel comfortable teasing Plato, or I don't know, it feels weird to me, but it's like, yeah, like other people you look up to did tease him. So maybe, yeah, there's a lesson there. Not taking it too seriously.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and then I think we've covered some of the main ideas of cynicism, some of the challenges, perhaps a bit about Antisthenes. Um, Something I like about Antisthenes is something that Zeno says about him, where Zeno said that, or sorry, it wasn't Zeno, it was Xenophon. Xenophon calls him the most agreeable of men in conversation and the most temperate in everything else. So that's interesting. You have this idea of moderation, temperance for the Cynics. I think that also connects to the philosopher we discussed recently, Aristippus, who one of the key themes of his philosophy is sort of being able to live well in any circumstance. Uh, and I think you all have these ideas of, well, what's required to do that? What's required to be excellent at conversation, be moderate in the use of everything, some amount of skill, and also you have this idea of the wise man is comfortable in any arena, and I think that's sort of exciting in a way. You have this idea of exploring the world, being put into different conversations, playing different roles, being put into different circumstances, and also I think does show it gives a promise of philosophy, as it's not something that's merely for verbal sparring. It's not merely book learning, as we would say, but a matter of competence, building skills, and something you can display in conversation. Denise was a warrior, so in war perhaps as well, um, and other arts. So that's something that I liked it in this passage from Diogenes Laertius on him.
Yeah, you can be confident about controversial claims and not be a jerk in conversation. You can stand by your opinions. You don't need to, I don't know, acquiesce or try to fit in. You can stand out. You can be unique. You can hold to what you believe, but you can still be agreeable. You can still be a good conversationalist. That's part one. And then the part you said is just that idea, which speaks to that idea of fitting in everywhere. I agree. I think that's a great, again, not fitting in everywhere by not selling yourself out, but again, just being agreeable. They don't need to necessarily be contradictory things here. Um, yeah, I think that's a nice idea too. That would be a nice. I would want people to say that of me.
Yeah, I think
Yeah, that
so.
guy was nice to talk to. Hey, he said some weird things. I really don't agree with him about that stuff he says about pain or whatever. But that was a good conversation. It was, it's thoughtful.
Yeah, absolutely. Any takeaways for you, or anything else you want to highlight?
I
Questions?
mean, I really do think some things that I've already raised, which is I think as we're doing this work, Caleb, we're fleshing out even for me because I in my academic research before this just really just focused on Stoicism. Didn't I looked at Aristotle and Plato, but didn't look a lot at these. I would say the kind of the family tree of Stoicism, and my takeaway is that really interesting to see that Socrates flowing to Antisthenes, which goes to Diogenes and then eventually to Zeno, and all the way through Stoicism, which parts of those threads were preserved, which parts of those were softened, and then how actually, that question of what is Stoicism, because when we look at our contemporary Stoics, there is that spectrum from Epictetus on one side to Seneca on the other, or not. I mean, I said contemporary, but I think Roman, but it's still just like 600 years after this. You get this spectrum of ways of interpreting the school, and I don't know. I guess one thing you're getting here is maybe this evidence that Cynic tradition, maybe that is Stoicism, maybe it's not, but it's certainly a really, really strong foundation we're seeing here. That's really where Stoicism came from, is from through Antisthenes, through the cynicism of Antisthenes. That's one takeaway that I think is cool. Another is that the cynicism, Diogenes gets a lot of, when we think about cynicism, we think about Diogenes the Cynic. Part of that is just because he did really funny things. There's a lot of funny stories. We talked about that in our podcast. A lot of really punchy anecdotes. But if you think of Antisthenes as the founder of cynicism, I mean, really, what do we get? We get a little bit more hardcore Stoicism. This kind of cynicism is not that different from Epictetus or Musonius Rufus. This kind of cynicism is virtue can be taught, virtue is sufficient for happiness, virtue is perhaps better taught through pain and bad reputation than pleasure and good reputation. That's and that virtue is actions. It's not learning or words. That's pretty darn Stoic to me. There's not that much of a gap. When we look at Diogenes the Cynic living in the barrel, there seems like a big gap, but here it's really not. It's not that much different than a Musonius Rufus. And you almost imagine if Musonius Rufus was around, he would hang out with Antisthenes more than he would hang out with the Seneca. And I don't know, there's something interesting there. The lines are not as clear as I once thought they were. I guess I'll put it that way. It really does feel to me more like a spectrum than a hard division between cynicism and Stoicism now.
Yeah, that's interesting. And that's it's certainly true that I think perhaps the Cynics weren't as organized as a formal school. So there's that organizational difference, historical difference. But some of those core ideas, that emphasis on virtue, that living according to nature, that's all there in cynicism, and that focus on minimalism is something we don't see as much in Antisthenes. So it wasn't always this rejection of material goods. It wasn't always rejection of the city. And of course, we see Cynic themes in the Roman Stoics, Epictetus and Musonius Rufus in particular. And so I think that's certainly a good spot to end, is thinking about some of these, both, I suppose, the historical, philosophical questions, in addition to that emphasis on some of these Stoic Cynic ideas around minimalism, thinking about what we can learn from pain, rejecting, even if not completely, significantly rejecting luxury, wealth, and such.
Yeah, I think that's a good point to end on. If not to become a cynic, then just to explore that maybe more cynical parts of Stoicism, which is a great idea to end on, I think.
Cool. All right. Well, thanks for doing this again. We'll be sure to do some other philosophers from Diogenes Laertius. It's been a lot of fun going through it. If y'all are curious, do check out the chapter on Antisthenes. It's quite short. It's an easy read. And send us any feedback or emails if there's another particular figure you'd like to cover, if you have any questions on this episode. Always enjoy getting emails from our listeners.
Awesome.
Cool. Thanks, Michael. Peace. Thanks for listening to Stoic Conversations. Please give us a rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify and share it with a friend. If you want to dive deeper still, search Stoa in the App Store or Play Store for a complete app with routines, meditations, and lessons designed to help people become more stoic. And I'd also like to thank Michael Levy for graciously letting us use his music. You can find more of his work at ancientlyre.com. And finally, please get in touch with us. Send a message to stoa@stoameditation.com if you ever have any feedback, questions, or recommendations. Until next time.